He was nothing more than a janitor, mop in hand, going unnoticeable by all, living in the background of a crowded airport. Yet in one instant, when everyone else turned a blind eye, he noticed something no one else did and decided to act. What does it take when the voice that is usually unheard is the one that saves lives? This is the tale of Marvin Hayes, a man with no badge or title, who altered the trajectory of a flight and countless lives with only experience, instinct, and courage to care. What did he perceive that others did not? And why did a billionaire, mere seconds from boarding, do everything in his power to hear him out? Occasionally, the individuals we ignore hold the knowledge we so desperately crave, and occasionally, listening can be stronger than any title or degree. Would you have caught the same detail? Would you have done something, even if nobody had believed you? Let's trace this real, life story of quiet courage, second chances, and the dignity that comes when someone finally recognizes your value. Because this isn't a tale of rescuing a plane. It's about the worth of being heard, and the remarkable in the mundane. It began like any other morning, peaceful, normal. The sort of tranquility that leads you to believe nothing at all could go awry. The sun had just begun its rise over the horizon, covering the tarmac with pale gold. Jets stood in line in silence like slumbering giants. Within Terminal C, early travelers consumed coffee, pulled their bags behind them, and rubbed sleep from their eyes at departure boards. The world was in motion, slowly, but in minutes. The calm beat changed. Flight 728, an ordinary morning run from Dallas to New York, was delayed, then delayed again. The engines roared to life. The boarding gate emptied. The jet bridge withdrew. But the plane sat still. Engines rumbled like a tiger biding its time. Cabin lights flashed, glowing weakly and then brightly again. But not a wheel rolled forward. Initially, the holdup was dismissed. Delays mechanically occur, people said, but 10 minutes went by, then 20, then 40, 5. Tension accumulated like a low-grade hum underneath everything. Passengers began to rouse. A business person wearing a gray suit looked at his Rolex and sighed. A teenager wearing earbuds pulled one out to ask, "Are we still not moving?" A mother of 2 toddlers attempted to distract them, cradling her youngest in her arms while the other plaintively asked repeatedly, "Why aren't we flying yet?" Outside the glass, ground staff hummed around the underside of the plane. A handful of mechanics orbited the aircraft. 2 knelt beside the wing, gesturing. One wiped his brow. Another kicked at a toolbox. Inside, gate agents huddled behind counters, staring at their screens, fingers moving swiftly over keyboards. One agent answered the phone. Her voice was low, somber. No announcements yet. No answers, just a delay, and in the background near Gate 7, quietly mopping the floor, was Marvin. To most, Marvin was just part of the scenery, a janitor in his blue coveralls, pushing a cart that squeaked slightly with every turn. He moved slowly but deliberately, always neat, always silent. People passed him without a glance. Nobody asked his name. Nobody cared where he went after his shift. But Marvin, he noticed everything. 18 years at that terminal, sun up to sundown, in snowstorms and blackouts, delays and emergencies. He'd witnessed weeping travelers, irate executives, runaway toddlers, and once even a loose cat that had escaped from its carrier and spent the day hiding in ceiling tiles over Gate D5. He also noticed things most people didn't: the rhythms, the patterns, the language of an airport when something was amiss. And something that morning didn't feel right. Marvin paused near the large windows, looking out at Flight 728. He saw what the average traveler couldn't. Not the lights, not the wheels, the leak. A dark, thin trail snaking out from under the rear left landing gear. Barely noticeable unless you'd seen it before, but Marvin had. He recalled the same leak from nearly a decade prior, on a different plane, different airline. Then it had been discovered by a mechanic pre-takeoff. It was a malfunction in the auxiliary gear system, a problem that wouldn't prevent a plane from starting up, or even taxiing, but one that might lock up the wheels halfway down the runway. If it were to occur at top speed, just short of lift, off, the results would be ghastly. Marvin moved closer to the window. The 2 engineers outside were still gesturing at the wing, at something else altogether. He shook his head. They were focusing on the wrong object. His hand went tighter around the mop handle. He glanced over at the gate desk. One of the agents was still on the phone, scowling furiously. Another was typing, unaware of what was going on outside. Marvin had no badge, no technical degree, no title. But he had something else, experience. He walked slowly but firmly toward the gate counter. People barely noticed him as he stepped past the rows of seated passengers. Just the janitor, they thought. He stopped at the counter and waited. The young woman behind it barely glanced up. "Sorry, sir. Please return to your waiting area." We're experiencing a delay. Marvin cleared his throat. You have to stop that plane. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. Excuse me, there's a fluid leak beneath the rear gear. He spoke softly. If I'm not mistaken, that's the auxiliary system leaking, not the brakes, not the engine. You let them taxi. Those wheels might lock up before they've even left the ground. The agent blinked. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to. I worked maintenance for 10 years prior to when I got this job. I've seen this before. She scowled. Sir, I can't. And that's when someone else overheard him. Someone who wasn't merely walking by. Marvin had worked at the airport for a full 18 years. Not in an office, not in the tower, not in a position of power, but on the ground where the dust landed, where tires touched the concrete, and where all the people passed by him without so much as a glance. He didn't mind. He wasn't there for attention. He was there to work, and above all, to observe. You learn a lot about a place when you re-invisible. The comings and goings, the way people move when they're anxious, the way mechanics shout when something isn't quite right, even the tone in a pilot's voice when a warning light flashes on the panel. Marvin heard it all. Every whisper behind the check, in desk, every low-tone conversation between the engineers. Every shift in the weather long before the forecast caught up. He didn't have an engineering degree or an elaborate resume, but he did have something more important in moments such as these, a memory honed by time and a brain that refused to quit. That morning, as Flight 728 stubbornly remained on the tarmac, Marvin stopped next to the huge glass window. He could see the plane easily from where he was. Two engineers knelt next to the left wing, nodding towards something and shaking their heads. One scratched behind his ear. The other cleaned his hands with a rag stained with grease. Their discussion appeared argumentative. Passengers wouldn't have paid it any attention, but Marvin did. He squinted and turned his attention somewhat to the back of the plane. That's where he noticed it, a thin trail of black liquid flowing from the rear landing gear. It shone very slightly in morning light. It wasn't much, a thin stream of liquid most would have overlooked. Assuming it was water or oil drippage from the rain the week before, Marvin recognized it immediately. Hydraulic fluid, leaking, and not where it should be. No, he breathed to himself, not the brakes. It's the auxiliary gear. He'd observed it previously around a decade ago. Various airline, various plane, similar problem. And during that time, it had nearly caused a hazardous situation in the runway. That time, the mechanic noticed the fluid on a regular checkup. In good time, this time. No one was checking the correct location. Marvin froze for a moment, mop still clutched in hand, heartbeat slightly faster. What if nobody stops it? What if they push that plane forward, relying on sensors and checklists, thinking it's a brief delay? The very thought ran a shiver up his spine. Because Marvin wasn't a man given to melodrama or leaping to conclusions. He'd cleaned up after more emergencies than he could count. Fire drills, evacuations, delays, and diversions. But this was different. He propped the mop handle against the wall, straightened his back, and strode towards the gate desk. He didn't hurry. Marvin didn't believe in panic, but he moved with purpose, purposeful. The terminal remained full of exhausted passengers waiting for answers. Most didn't even look at him as he passed. Behind the desk, a young gate agent glanced up for a moment. "Excuse me, sir," she murmured, preoccupied. "You need to move back from the counter." Marvin inched forward, low but firm voice. "You have to get them from moving that plane," he told her. The agent blinked, furrowing her brows. "What are you saying?" "There's a leak beneath the rear gear," Marvin said, pointing toward the window. "It's not the brakes, it's the auxiliary gear system. I've seen that leak before. If they taxi that plane, it will seize up in mid-runway." The agent smiled at him, the polite but exhausted kind you give to someone who looks bewildered. "Sir, I understand your concern, but this is a technical issue. We have maintenance on premise." Marvin didn't move. "Then have them examine the rear gear. They're inspecting the wrong thing." The agent's tone hardened marginally. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to go back to your seat." There was a moment, brief but maddening, in which Marvin wavered. He'd done what he could. Perhaps it wasn't his business. Perhaps no one would listen to a janitor. Then, a voice broke through the tension. "Wait. What did you just say?" Marvin turned around. A tall, navy blue suited man had stepped in beside him. Distinguished. Clean cut. He sported a silver watch that seemed impossibly pricey for someone taking the commercial flight. His briefcase was crisp against his leg. His eyes were sharp, focused. Marvin stood up. "They've got a leak beneath the rear gear of Flight 728. It's the auxiliary hydraulic system. They're inspecting the wing. That's not the issue. The man looked at Marvin a beat too long. And how would you know that? I spent 10 years in maintenance before I switched to custodial, Marvin answered flatly. I witnessed a similar breakdown back in 2014. Same fluid trail. Same quiet before something happened. The man spun to the gate attendant. Call the ground crew. Have them inspect the rear gear. Now. Aye, sir. I can't just. The man drew out his ID and pushed it across the counter. It had a gold crest and the insignia. Charles, Benson, executive advisor, United Aerotech. The agent went white. Yes, sir. Immediately, as the call got made and technicians were sent back out to the plane, Marvin backed away, having no idea what had just occurred. He had no idea who Charles Benson was. Not yet. But he was about to learn, and the path of Marvin's peaceful existence was forever going to be altered. A dark blue, clad man of great height had been standing only a few feet from the action, a witness, a spectator. His name was Charles Benson. And although he didn't wear a spotlight, almost every person in that terminal knew him. Not because he was a celebrity in the Hollywood meaning, but because he rubbed shoulders with the rich and powerful where money and power are whispered in hushed tones behind locked doors. A tech billionaire investor, founder of Benson Aerospace Solutions, and most importantly a prime stakeholder in the very airline operating Flight 728. He wasn't just a passenger sitting and waiting to get home. He owned the system propelling that plane into flight. Charles had arrived at the airport unobtrusively that morning. No entourage, no media, just a briefcase and a carry-on bag. He preferred it that way. He enjoyed observing the machinery of commercial flight on the ground close up where the true stories unfolded. And this morning, observing from Gate 7, he saw something that tugged at his reporter's instincts. Not the delay, not the complaining travelers. The janitor. Charles wasn't the kind to dismiss people. He'd built his empire reading the room, observing the forgotten, the overlooked, the underestimated. And Marvin wasn't merely mopping. He was intent, observing the plane, reading the room. Something in the way he intently observed the engineers struck Charles's curiosity. And then the time came. Charles listened for Marvin's voice, low, steady, persistent. There's a leak beneath the rear gear. It's the auxiliary hydraulic system. They're inspecting the wing. That's not the issue. Charles moved forward a step. Excuse me, what did you just say? Marvin spun around, not expecting to be spoken to by someone looking so crisp. He explained again more slowly. It's the auxiliary gear assembly. I noticed a leak, same as one I noticed 10 years ago. If they taxi that plane, it could seize up before it gets off the runway. Charles watched him, his keen eyes narrowing a little. You're in janitorial. I was in maintenance, Marvin responded. 10 years. Then custodial to take care of my wife when she fell ill. Less travel. More consistent hours. No pride, just truth. Charles shook his head, then headed for the gate desk. Cancel the flight, he told the agent. Excuse me, she blinked. I'd like that plane grounded. I'd like the crew off the plane. Now. Her voice stuttered. Sir, respectfully. Unless you are a Charles reached calmly into his breast pocket and displayed his ID. It was more than a badge. It was a board member ID with complete control of flight operations. The agent's mouth dropped open ever so slightly. Yes, sir. I will call the ground team at once. She grasped the phone in shaking fingers and dialed. In seconds, tension crackled through the air. You could sense the temperature in the terminal shift. Charles faced Marvin again. You mentioned this occurred before, he said. Marvin nodded. In 2014, plane same model. Then the mechanic was able to detect the leak before takeoff. They grounded the plane, swapped out the valve, avoided a whole lot of trouble, and if they hadn't, Marvin paused, then spoke softly. Landing gear would have locked on the runway. If it occurred just prior to lift off, it could have been disastrous. Charles didn't answer immediately, just nodded softly. They stood there in silence for a moment, shoulder to shoulder, as the mechanics outside made it to the back of the aircraft. More texts came, radios crackled. One guy crouched next to the equipment looking at the leak Marvin had noticed almost an hour ago. And then another. Marvin could see by the way they hunched over, it wasn't good. A few minutes more, and a supervisor showed. Up on the tarmac talking into a walkie. The pilot's side door opened. Crew started getting off. Then the announcement was made. Ladies and gentlemen, we're sorry to say that Flight 728 has been canceled because of a technical problem. Passengers will be rescheduled shortly. There was a murmur of groans through the terminal, indignant sighs, shock, but not one person had any idea just how close they'd come to much worse. Charles spun around to Marvin. You just saved a full plane of people. Marvin shook his head. I just spoke up. Someone else made the decision. No, Charles told him firmly. You noticed what nobody else did, and you spoke when nobody else would listen. He offered his hand. Charles Benson. Marvin shook it, a little bewildered but courteous. Marvin Hayes. Charles smiled. I'd like to talk with you, not here. When you're off duty. You have skills I believe my company could utilize. Marvin blinked. I clean floors, sir. Not any longer you. Don't, Charles told him. In the background, the ground crew went on and checked out the plane. One of the engineers came over to the gate agent and handed her a clipboard. She looked at the paper and then she looked over at Marvin. It was all right there in black and white, a defective auxiliary valve. Exactly as Marvin had predicted. If they'd made the plane, taxi. If they'd pushed down the runway, the hydraulic failure might have jammed the gear, steered the plane off course, or worse, made it unable to take off at all. It would have been on the front page for all the wrong reasons, but that did not occur because someone was paying attention. And here was the owner of the equipment behind this, airline the billionaire in the suit, now gazing at the janitor not as a cleaner, but as a human being who might just have saved a catastrophe. Charles did not look for a title, he looked at wisdom. And in that instant, Marvin's life changed quietly, and forever. The crisis had passed. The terminal gradually came back to its usual hum. Flight 728 was technically grounded, and another plane was already being ready to take its place. The travelers, while irate, were alive, unharmed, and mostly oblivious to how close they'd just come to disaster. A few were waiting in line for new boarding passes. Others were sitting staring at their phones, never knowing that a small, quiet choice had altered the course of that morning and perhaps their lives. The flight team appeared rattled. Maintenance techs whispered among themselves, going over documents verifying the malfunction in the auxiliary valve that Marvin had indicated. And even though the scene hummed with behind the scene's tension, the individual at the hub of it all had retreated quietly to his cart. Marvin was sweeping again. Same mup, same hallway, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. Because to Marvin, doing his job properly was remarkable, whether or not anyone cared. But Charles Benson had. Having fielded a handful of calls and texts, Charles drifted out of the business lounge and made his way back toward the staff corridor by Terminal C. He caught up with Marvin, rolling his cart slowly down a side passage, the quiet creak of wheels echoing beneath the fluorescent lighting. Mr. Hayes, Charles said. Marvin spun. Yes, sir. How did you know? Charles asked. Not because he didn't believe it, but he was simply curious. Marvin rested on the mop and shrugged, as if the answer were obvious. I've seen it before. Same type of leak. Same type of confusion. I pay attention. Charles looked at him for a moment. Tough could sin. Charles looked at him for a moment. You're in aviation. Marvin smiled softly. I mop floors, sir. That's all. Charles smiled, though his look was introspective. Not anymore, you don't. There was a silence. Marvin's eyebrows furrowed a little. What do you mean? I mean, Charles said, moving forward. Come on. I'd like to take you out for a coffee. Marvin blinked. He glanced down at his uniform, hands still somewhat damp from the mop. Like this. Exactly like this, Charles said. And with that, the billionaire took the janitor to the executive lounge, a room Marvin had passed 1,000 times without ever having set foot in. The doors slid open with an almost silent hiss. The carpet was plush. The lights were turned down just enough to give everything a peaceful feel. Soft jazz floated in the background. People looked when they saw Charles come in, but they looked slightly longer when they saw with whom he arrived. Marvin did not care. He sat at a table in the corner, sipping black coffee from a porcelain mug, not knowing what to do with his hands. Charles wasted no time. Tell me what happened the last time you saw a leak like that. And Marvin explained. Not only about the leak, but about the years he spent working maintenance before switching to custodial duty. About his wife's illness that made him take a step back. About how he never ceased observing things even when no one was paying attention to him. Charles asked questions, listened, took notes. It wasn't a performance. It was respect. At the conclusion of their exchange, Charles told Marvin, Marvin, I want to put you on my team. Marvin appeared stunned. Your team. I own Benson Aerospace. We create and inspect the same systems you saw today. I have PhD engineers who've never seen what you've seen. I don't care about your title. I care about your eyes, your instincts, and your experience. But I don't have a degree, Marvin replied slowly. Charles leaned forward. And I don't possess your type of vision. Let's level the playing field. The very next day, Charles made it official. Marvin became a field systems consultant. No interview, no resume, simply a handshake. But Charles didn't stop there. He had Marvin sign up for a fast-track certificate program in aviation systems diagnostics on the company's dime. The company even placed Marvin with a mentor and provided him with a workstation close to their engineering floor. At age 57, Marvin was the newest addition to a company full of men half his age, and twice as impressed with what he had to offer. He was no longer invisible. He progressed from pushing a mop to pushing boundaries of flight safety innovation. His first handicouts, tall tales of close calls, strange noises, peculiar odors were now worth something. The engineers paid attention. The company did. America started paying attention as well. 3 months later, a brief piece made the national TV news. Janitor turned. Aviation consultant saves plane, inspires industry reform. But Marvin didn't appreciate the attention, never saw the clip, never enjoyed hearing himself discussed. What was important to him was something different. One day, Charles came upon Marvin standing silently by a hangar window, observing planes coming in. "You okay?" Charles asked. Marvin nodded painstakingly. "You know, I used to think all I'd ever be doing was cleaning up after people." He turned and smiled. "But now, I help keep them safe before they ever hit the ground." Charles put a hand on his shoulder. "You always did. The world's just finally catching up." A year went by. Flight 728 was no longer merely a flight number. It was a legend told in aviation safety training, engineering schools, even leadership seminars. Not because the plane went down, but because it didn't. Because someone noticed what others overlooked and spoke up when it mattered. The tale spread not with bravado, but with quiet respect. In an age consumed by titles, speed, and blaring voices, people relished in Marvin's peace. He hadn't shouted. In every sped Majwin, he hadn't insisted on being heard. He just told the truth when it counted and saved lives in the process. Marvin Hayes became a quiet legend at Benson Aerospace, not a celebrity, not a viral hit, just respected. New recruits asked to meet him. Engineers sought his input. Interns trailed behind him in the hangar with notebooks. Marvin initially laughed at being the center of attention. He didn't perceive himself as anybody special, but as time went on, he realized the position he now held. He was a symbol, not only of humility, but of potential. Of what occurs when someone who is looked over gets noticed for what they really are. In one leadership conference, Charles Benson was asked what made that day at the airport stand out to him. His response made headlines. "I've spent billions designing systems, buying software, hiring experts. But none of that saved Flight 728, a janitor did. Not because he had a fancy title, not because of a nameplate on his desk. He saved us because he paid attention, and that's what leadership is. Knowing how to listen to the quiet voice in the back of the room." Those words stuck. They were plastered on posters in Benson Aerospace's headquarters, hung framed in the training rooms of 3 separate airlines, even included in onboarding packets for new flight crew. And Marvin, he continued working, not with a mop anymore, but with groups of engineers who now designed systems with him, not around him. He assisted in rewriting pre-taxi inspection procedures. He indicated subtle signs no one ever considered measuring. He even played a role in creating a new warning algorithm to find rear gear hydraulic leaks earlier, based on the incident he had averted. They dubbed it the Marvin flag. Nevertheless, occasionally, Marvin would walk quietly through Terminal C. He never wore a badge or a company jacket, only his usual windbreaker and scuffed up work shoes. He'd greet the gate agents with a nod, smile at the janitors, talk to the ground crew if they weren't swamped, and whenever someone asked him what he was doing there, he always had the same reply, like, "Just making sure everything's okay." For Marvin, though, it had never been about rank. It had always been about individuals, about safety, about paying attention to the things others overlooked. Late one afternoon, a young technician found him by the employee's coffee machine. "Mr. Hayes," the tech asked, fidgety. "Just Marvin," he said with a grin. I heard about Flight 728. We read it in orientation. I just wanted to say, I think what you did was amazing." Marvin nodded. "Thanks, son. I hope I'd do the same if I saw something wrong." Marvin regarded him warmly. "Don't hope," he said. "Prepare. That way, when the moment arrives, you don't freeze. You just step forward." The young man hesitated, then said, "How'd you know to say something that day? Weren't you scared nobody would believe you?" Marvin's reply was subdued. "Oh, I figured they wouldn't, but I didn't care. I'd rather speak and be wrong than be silent and watch something go wrong." He ruffled the young tech's arm. "Just keep in mind, truth don't need permission to be spoken. It just needs a voice." That quote also would eventually find itself on the break room wall in a framed place of honor. Marvin was awarded over time, more than he could number, a Mayor's Community Leadership Award, a National Medal for Safety, even a wing of the Benson Aerospace campus itself, a little nook labeled Hayes Observation Bay, where every new engineer did their initial shadow rotation. Marvin, though, never became comfortable with all the attention. He always went back to the same truth. He wasn't trying to be heroic. He was simply doing what he did every day, listening. In one of his very few interviews, a reporter asked him, "What do you want people to recall about your story?" Marvin gazed off contemplatively for an instant, then replied, "It's not where you stand. It's what you see when nobody's looking. I spent years sweeping floors others made filthy without regard, but I always observed, always heard. That day, I just so happened to be where I was supposed to be with eyes open." The reporter inquired of him whether he missed his previous job. Marvin smiled. "You never lose being a janitor," he said. "You just begin to clean different types of messes." And that's the story of how a struggling black janitor, pulling a peaceful shift at a mundane airport, diffused a possible disaster in 2 seconds, not with authority, not with wealth, but with focus. And in return, a billionaire, a man accustomed to soaring above the clouds, finally glanced down, saw a man who had been passed over for decades, and raised him up where he belonged. Because sometimes the hero isn't the one yelling the loudest in the room. Occasionally, he's the one with the mop. Sometimes it's in the quiet moments when no one's watching, no one's listening, that a person's true strength shines through. Marvin didn't save that flight because it was his job. He did it because he cared, because he paid attention, because he chose to act when it would have been easier to stay silent. And that's something many of us carry too. Those quiet instincts, those unnoticed strengths we've built through years of living, observing, and simply showing up. We all encounter times when we think we're invisible, like our opinions don't count. But then there are stories such as Marvin's, which remind us that worth is not determined by title or rank. It's determined by heart, by understanding, by the bravery to do right even when no one requests it. Perhaps today is an opportunity to catch someone others have missed, or celebrate the quiet strengths in you. Either way, the little things we do, they can make all the difference.